somewhere in your medicine cabinet, or your parents' medicine cabinet, or the one at the pharmacy down the street, there's a good chance a small pill with the letters OC pressed into it has passed through at some point in the last 30 years. It was supposed to be a miracle, a pain reliever so advanced, so carefully engineered, that doctors were told it was almost impossible to get addicted to it. Millions of prescriptions, billions of dollars. A family so wealthy they gave their name to wings of the Louvre, the Smithsonian, Oxford, the Guggenheim, the Met. Walls of marble with one word chiseled into them, over and over, in a dozen countries. You'd assume a drug this trusted, made by a company this respected, earned its place through genuine medical breakthrough. A better molecule, a smarter delivery system. Real science rewarded fairly. However, some would say that's exactly the story they wanted you to believe. And once you understand how OxyContin actually became the best-selling painkiller in American history, you'll never look at a prescription bottle or a museum wing quite the same way again. So how did a quiet, family-owned pharmaceutical company in Stamford, Connecticut, become the company most directly blamed for one of the deadliest public health disasters in modern American history? To understand that, we have to go back to Brooklyn in the 1930s. Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler were the sons of Galician Jewish immigrants, raised in a cramped apartment during the Depression, in a household where money was tight and expectations were not. Their father ran a small grocery store. All three boys were pushed toward medicine, and all three delivered, Arthur first, then his younger brothers close behind. All three eventually earning medical degrees, all three drawn specifically to psychiatry. Arthur, the eldest, was brilliant and restless, the kind of person who could hold down a full medical residency, a research post at a state psychiatric hospital in Queens, and a side career in advertising, all at the same time, without seeming to sleep. At Creedmoor State Hospital, he co-authored genuinely serious research into the biological basis of schizophrenia, at a time when psychiatry was still dominated by Freudian talk therapy. He wasn't a fraud or a dilettante. He was, by every account, a legitimately gifted physician-scientist. But somewhere along the way, Arthur discovered something that interested him more than treating patients directly: the machinery of persuasion. In 1942, he took a job at a small four-person advertising agency called William Douglas McAdams. It sold medicine, but it did so the way Madison Avenue sold cigarettes and soap, with slogans, with repetition, with confidence dressed up as science, delivered directly into the hands of the one person in America whose signature could turn a chemical into a prescription, the family doctor. It worked, spectacularly. Arthur helped turn a chemical manufacturer named Pfizer into a prescription drug empire, teaching them to build a real sales force instead of leaning on distributors. He took Hoffmann La Roche's new tranquilizer Librium, and then its successor Valium, and built them into the two best-selling drugs in the country, marketing directly to physicians through a medical newspaper he owned outright called the Medical Tribune, which eventually reached hundreds of thousands of doctors across dozens of countries. He understood, before almost anyone else in the industry, that if you could get a doctor to trust your message, you didn't need to convince the patient at all. The doctor would do it for you, with the full authority of a medical degree behind it. By the early 1970s, Valium alone was generating more than $2 billion for his clients, at a time when $1 billion still meant something. Arthur Sackler didn't just sell medicine. He invented the modern template for how medicine gets sold to doctors, and his two younger brothers, working quietly beside him, were watching every step of it. In 1952, the three brothers pooled their money and bought a small, struggling drug manufacturer called Purdue Frederick, a company that had been founded 60 years earlier by two doctors selling a glycerin and sherry tonic they claimed cured everything from indigestion to nervous exhaustion. It wasn't much of a business by the 1950s, but the Sacklers weren't buying a product line. They were buying a vehicle, a quiet, private, entirely family-controlled company they could eventually pour their marketing instincts into, on their own terms, answerable to no outside shareholders. For decades, Purdue stayed modest, selling laxatives, earwax remover, and antiseptic cream, a sleepy family concern working in Arthur's shadow while he built his real fortune elsewhere in advertising and art collecting. Then, in 1987, Arthur Sackler died of a heart attack. His third of the company passed to his brothers rather than his own children. And with him gone, Raymond and Mortimer, and soon their children, particularly Raymond's son Richard, were free to chase something considerably bigger than earwax remover. By the late 1980s, Purdue had already found modest, genuine success with a slow-release morphine pill for late-stage cancer patients called MS-Contin. It worked by delivering medication over 12 hours instead of 4, meaning fewer doses, steadier relief through the night, and less of the exhausting up and down cycle that came with older painkillers. Hospice doctors, who spent their days trying to keep dying patients comfortable, genuinely liked it. It was a real, useful piece of pharmacology, and for a niche cancer care market, it made Purdue a modest amount of money and a great deal of goodwill. And it planted an idea in Richard Sackler's mind, one he pursued for most of the 1990s. What if you took that same slow-release mechanism and applied it to a different opioid entirely, oxycodone, a molecule nearly twice as potent as morphine? And instead of marketing it narrowly to cancer wards and hospice programs, you marketed it to every doctor in America who treated ordinary, everyday chronic pain, bad backs, arthritic knees, post-surgical recovery, a market that dwarfed the cancer care niche by a factor of 100, populated by family doctors who had far less specialized training in how to manage a powerful narcotic responsibly. There was, to be fair, a genuine and sympathetic medical argument underneath all of this at the time. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, a real movement inside American medicine had been pushing back against decades of undertreated pain, patients with chronic conditions who were routinely denied adequate relief because doctors, trained to fear addiction above almost everything else, simply wouldn't prescribe strong enough painkillers for long enough. Advocacy groups and pain specialists argued, with real evidence behind them, that this reflexive caution was leaving millions of Americans suffering unnecessarily. Purdue's marketing didn't invent that movement. It absorbed it, funded parts of it, and rode it, turning a legitimate and overdue conversation about undertreated pain into the exact justification it needed to put a powerful narcotic into the hands of general practitioners who had never been trained to manage one. In 1995, the FDA approved a new drug application for exactly that pill. The medical reviewer who oversaw it, a physician named Curtis Wright, signed off on label language that would end up defining the next decade of American medicine. Because OxyContin released its dose slowly over time, the label claimed it was believed to reduce its potential for abuse compared to instant-release opioids. There was no clinical trial that actually demonstrated that claim in real-world conditions. It was a theory, plausible on paper, stated on the official government-approved label as though it were settled, proven fact. A year later, Curtis Wright left the FDA, and within roughly 2 years, he was working for Purdue Pharma directly, in a research and clinical role, at a salary reportedly close to 3 times what he'd made as a federal regulator. OxyContin launched in 1996, and Purdue did not treat it like a niche cancer drug. They treated it like a consumer product with a marketing budget and sales infrastructure to match. The sales force, which had been modest for decades, nearly tripled within a few years, and every one of those representatives carried the same message into every doctor's office in the country. Bonuses were tied directly to how many milligrams of OxyContin got prescribed in a representative's territory, not whether patients actually got better, not whether the drug was being used appropriately, just raw volume moved. Physicians, particularly ones who wrote a lot of prescriptions, were flown to all expenses paid pain management seminars at resorts in Florida and Arizona, golf included. Free starter coupons, good for a full month's supply, were mailed directly to doctors' offices by the thousands, a tactic almost never used for a Schedule II narcotic before. And the sales pitch, again and again, leaned on that unproven line lifted straight from the label. This drug, unlike other opioids on the market, was different, safer, less addictive, a breakthrough, not just another narcotic. It worked better than anyone at Purdue could have reasonably hoped. At the drug's launch party in 1996, Richard Sackler, Raymond's son, and by then the company's president, stood up in front of the sales team and told them to imagine a series of natural disasters stacked on top of each other. An earthquake, a hurricane, a blizzard, all rolled into one event. The launch of OxyContin, he told them, would be followed by a blizzard of prescriptions so deep, so dense, and so white it would bury the competition. It wasn't an idle boast. Sales reached the company's own aggressive first-year target, 4 months ahead of schedule. By 2000, OxyContin was generating more than $1 billion a year in revenue. By the middle of that decade, it was reportedly outselling Viagra. And Purdue, a company almost nobody outside the pharmaceutical industry had ever heard of a decade earlier, had become one of the most profitable privately held companies in the country. This is the part of the story that in almost any other Build Inc. episode would be the whole triumphant arc, the family business, the clever reformulation of an old idea, the marketing genius passed down like a family trade from one generation to the next, the billion-dollar payoff earned through genuine strategic brilliance. And to be clear, none of that part is fabricated. Purdue really did build one of the most effective, most disciplined pharmaceutical sales operations in American history. Whatever else you conclude about this company, by the end of this video, you have to concede that the growth was real. The product genuinely did something useful for a lot of patients in pain, and the execution was ruthless in its precision. But somewhere in that growth curve, a door opened that would never close again. Internally, within the first few years of OxyContin hitting the market, reports were already surfacing that should have stopped the momentum cold. Patients were crushing the tablets to defeat the slow-release coating entirely, then snorting or injecting the full 12-hour dose all at once, turning a controlled-release painkiller into one of the most potent, instant-hit opioids available anywhere. Pharmacies in rural Appalachia, parts of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Maine were being robbed at gunpoint for OxyContin specifically, by name, the way a jewelry store gets robbed for diamonds. Doctors on the ground started calling it hillbilly heroin, because in some of the hardest hit small towns in the country, that's genuinely, functionally what it had become. Purdue's own field representatives were filing reports back to the Home Office describing exactly this pattern, town after town. And according to court records that would surface years later in litigation, Purdue's own leadership discussed the abuse problem internally as early as 1997, barely a year after launch, in meetings and memos, while the company continued telling doctors, regulators, and the public that the addiction risk was low. That's the pivot. Not one single dramatic villain moment you can point to on a calendar, but a quiet, sustained choice, made and remade for years afterward. Keep selling the story the label allowed. Keep training the sales force to lean on it, even after the people selling it had every reason to know the story wasn't holding up out in the real world. And once that choice got made the first time, it would get made again and again. This is the exact point where the story stopped being about a family that built something remarkable out of a forgotten tonic company and starts being about what they were willing to look away from in order to keep building it. By the early 2000s, federal prosecutors in Virginia were building a criminal case, drawing on internal company documents and testimony from former employees. Investigators found that Purdue sales representatives had, in some well-documented instances, continued calling on doctors who were effectively running pill mills, prescribing enormous quantities of opioids with little to no medical justification. One physician in particular, known to his own patients as the Candyman, was visited by Purdue representatives more than 300 separate times, even as red flags about his prescribing patterns piled up in plain view. In 2007, 3 senior Purdue executives, not the Sacklers themselves, but the company's president, its top lawyer, and its chief medical officer, pleaded guilty to a federal felony charge of misbranding OxyContin, formally admitting the company had claimed the drug was less prone to abuse than competing painkillers when internal evidence said otherwise. Purdue paid $600 million, one of the largest fines a pharmaceutical company had ever faced at that point. The 3 executives paid personal fines out of their own pockets. None of them served a single day in prison. And remarkably, OxyContin sales barely paused. The company kept manufacturing the same drug, largely the same way, marketed largely the same way, for another decade. But that wasn't even the worst of it, because right around the same time, Purdue was staring down a different kind of deadline. Its original patent on OxyContin was set to expire, which meant cheaper generic versions were about to flood the market and cut into the billions the family had built its fortune on. Purdue's response was to develop a new, reformulated version of the pill in 2010, one that was genuinely harder to crush and snort, and to market that reformulation loudly as proof of the company's commitment to safety. What got far less attention at the time was that the timing of the reformulation lined up almost perfectly with the patent expiration, and that the new formula gave Purdue's lawyers grounds to argue, in courtrooms and before regulators, that the older, more easily abused version should be pulled from the market entirely, clearing the way for the newer, still patented version to keep the money flowing for years longer than it otherwise would have. Public health researchers were divided on whether the reformulation actually reduced overall opioid harm, since data later showed some users simply switched to heroin once the pills got harder to abuse. Either way, it was a business decision dressed in the language of harm reduction, and it worked exactly as intended. Because while American prosecutors were extracting that guilty plea in 2007, a separate branch of the family's business, a company called Purdue Pharma, controlled by relatives of the same Sackler family and legally distinct from the American entity, was quietly expanding an almost identical playbook into brand new markets overseas. Sales representatives in Latin America, Europe, and parts of Asia were trained using strategies drawn directly from Purdue's American approach, minimize the addiction risk in marketing materials, court prescribing doctors with hospitality, honoraria, and sponsored conferences, and lobby regulators and medical associations in country after country to loosen historically conservative guidelines around opioid prescribing. Public health researchers, watching from the outside, would later describe seeing the opening moves of an opioid crisis unfold in real time in countries that had never had one before, built using a strategy the Sackler family already knew, by 2007 at the very latest, had produced catastrophic harm back home. We're only just getting started. And then, there's what happened to the family's own reputation, which for decades had been built as carefully and deliberately as the sales force. For most of the 20th century, the Sackler name was synonymous not with opioids, but with philanthropy on a genuinely staggering scale. Wings named after them at the Louvre in Paris, the Smithsonian in Washington, the Guggenheim and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, Oxford and Cambridge in England, universities and hospitals across 3 continents. It was, by design, one of the most effective reputation laundering operations any wealthy family had ever run, decades before anyone used that phrase. And once journalists and eventually artists and activists started connecting the dots between the museum donor plaques and the overdose statistics, the reputation collapsed with startling speed. Photographer Nan Goldin, who had survived her own OxyContin addiction, organized protest after protest inside the very museum galleries that bore the family's name, dropping prescription bottles into the reflecting pool at the Guggenheim, staging die-ins beneath Sackler-funded ceilings. One by one, over the following years, the Louvre, the Met, the Guggenheim, the Tate, the American Museum of Natural History, and Oxford's Sackler Library all announced they would remove the family name from their walls entirely. A name that had taken 3 generations and hundreds of millions of dollars to build into a symbol of cultured generosity was scrubbed from marble in the span of about 3 years. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the death toll kept climbing in a way that no fine and no removed plaque could undo. Emergency rooms in Ohio, Florida, and West Virginia were treating overdose after overdose, sometimes the same patients returning again and again until they didn't come back at all. Foster care systems in Appalachian counties were overwhelmed with children removed from homes where one or both parents had died or become incapacitated by an addiction that, for a significant share of these families, had started with nothing more dramatic than a legitimate prescription after a workplace injury or a wisdom tooth extraction. Congressional investigators later estimated that opioid-related overdoses, a category OxyContin helped popularize, normalize, and expand into the general population, have contributed to more than 900,000 deaths in the United States since 1999. To be fair, and this deserves to be said plainly rather than rushed past, it would be dishonest to lay the entirety of a decades-long national opioid crisis at the feet of one company and one family. Heroin and later illicit fentanyl manufactured largely overseas would go on to cause the majority of overdose deaths in the crisis's later years, driven by dealers and cartels who had never heard of Purdue Pharma and never needed to. Most of the pharmaceutical sales representatives who spent their careers pushing OxyContin were, by every credible account, ordinary employees doing an ordinary job, following bonus structures handed down from above, genuinely unaware of just how bad the internal warning signs had become at the corporate level. Not everyone at Purdue was Richard Sackler, and not every doctor who prescribed OxyContin in good faith was reckless or corrupt. But that's precisely what makes this story so uncomfortable to sit with. A genuinely destructive outcome doesn't require an entire company full of villains. It only requires an incentive structure that nobody with the power to interrupt it was willing to interrupt. And that brings us to the part of this story that even people who had followed the OxyContin scandal for years closely still found hard to fully stomach. What happened to the money once the lawsuits started closing in. Court documents and later investigative reporting revealed that between roughly 2008 and 2018, the exact years when the scale of the opioid crisis was becoming impossible for anyone to ignore, and when Purdue was facing an accelerating wave of lawsuits from state governments, counties, and hospital systems, members of the Sackler family withdrew more than $10 billion out of the company. Some of it moved into family trusts. Some of it moved overseas, into holding companies and accounts structured, according to plaintiffs' attorneys who spent years tracing the money, specifically to make it difficult for future litigants to ever reach. By the time thousands of lawsuits from states, counties, hospitals, and grieving individual families converged on Purdue in 2019, the company itself had far less money sitting inside it than the family that owned it had already quietly taken out. Purdue filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in September of 2019. What followed was one of the strangest bankruptcy proceedings in American corporate history, not because the company itself was broke, exactly, but because, using the mechanics of the bankruptcy court, the Sackler family sought something highly unusual: a permanent legal shield protecting them personally, as individuals, from any future opioid-related lawsuit anywhere in the country, in exchange for contributing several billion dollars of their own private fortune toward the settlement pool. Crucially, they had not filed for personal bankruptcy themselves. They simply wanted the legal protections that come with one, without ever opening their own personal finances to the scrutiny the company's finances were now under in open court. Here's the plainest way to say what all of that ultimately meant, stripped of all the legal language and all the negotiating. To this day, no member of the Sackler family has ever been criminally convicted for their role in the opioid crisis. Victims and their families packed into bankruptcy hearings for years afterward, many testifying directly to members of the Sackler family for the first time in their lives, parents describing children who died in their 20s and 30s, spouses describing years of addiction that began with a single prescription after a minor surgery, siblings describing a decade of holidays with an empty chair at the table. Some members of the family expressed sympathy during those hearings, carefully, in measured language. None accepted personal legal responsibility for what the company had done. Richard Sackler, under oath, said he did not agree with several of the government's own characterizations of the company's admitted wrongdoing. The family later set up a website of their own, encouraging readers to judge for themselves, telling them that courts, government agencies, and the media had all misrepresented what the Sacklers actually said and actually did. The bankruptcy dragged on through years of appeals, eventually reaching the Supreme Court, which in 2024 ruled that federal bankruptcy law did not, in fact, allow the Sacklers to receive that kind of sweeping personal legal shield without the explicit consent of every single claimant involved. It sent the entire settlement back to the negotiating table, undoing years of painstaking legal work in a single ruling. Purdue and the family returned with a revised deal, a larger sum this time, more than $7 billion coming from the Sacklers directly, on top of whatever remained of Purdue's own corporate assets, structured to reach roughly $50 billion in total settlements once every related opioid case nationwide was folded in. It was, by any reasonable measure, an enormous number, one of the largest corporate settlements in American history. It was also for thousands of the families who had been waiting on it, arriving more than 15 years after the losses it was meant to address. And for some individual claimants, the payments that finally arrived amounted to only a few $1,000s each, a fraction of what a single funeral costs, spread across a class of victims that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. In the spring of 2026, after years of hearings, appeals, and delayed checks, the final pieces of that long settlement finally closed. Purdue Pharma, the company name that had existed in one form or another for over a century, permanently ceased operations. In its place rose a new organization called Purdue Pharma, non-profit owned, barred by permanent court order from ever marketing its opioid products, barred from lobbying regulators or lawmakers, forbidden from ever tying an employee's pay to how many prescriptions get written. Every member of the Sackler family is now permanently barred from ever selling opioids in the United States again, and none of them will hold any role whatsoever in the company that inherited their old one. The old name is gone from Stanford. The building has new owners. A drug the family once bet an entire dynasty on now exists inside a company that is legally required, forever, to never sell it the way Purdue once did. So Purdue Pharma and the family behind it genuinely built something extraordinary. Arthur Sackler didn't just make his younger brothers rich. He wrote the modern playbook for how pharmaceutical companies talk to doctors, and that playbook, in less destructive hands, has gone on to help bring plenty of legitimate, useful medicines to market over the decades since. His brothers and their children turned a forgotten glycerin tonic company into one of the most commercially dominant drug launches in American history, not once, but twice. First quietly, with MS-Contin, then explosively, with OxyContin. That part is true. Nobody serious disputes the sheer scale of what they built, or the strategic intelligence it took to build it. But billions of dollars moved out of that company in the very years its own executives already knew, in detail, what OxyContin had done to entire towns across Appalachia and beyond. And to this day, not one single Sackler has ever stood trial for it. And that raises a question that doesn't have a clean answer. How much distance does it really take, morally, between the decision of what to print on a drug label in 1995 and the decision, years later, of whose life gets quietly upended by that label being wrong? Is a fortune still yours to keep once a court has agreed that some meaningful share of it came from telling doctors something the company itself already doubted was true? The Sacklers' own defense, laid out over and over again across depositions, court filings, and press statements, ultimately comes down to a version of the same sentence. They say they never intended for any of this to happen. Maybe, for some of them, that's even sincere. But intention was never really the question that mattered most here. The label said the drug was unlikely to be abused. 900,000 deaths later, the label was wrong. And by the time anyone with real power inside that company was willing to say so out loud, in public, under oath, the money that mattered most to the family had already been moved somewhere the lawsuits couldn't reach. The pill still exists. It's still prescribed in far smaller numbers now, under far tighter restrictions, by a company that is legally forbidden from saying a single word to promote it. Somewhere in a filing cabinet inside a courthouse in White Plains, New York, sit boxes of depositions that nobody outside a handful of attorneys will ever read in full. Richard Sackler's own words about blizzards and prescription targets are sealed inside a case that technically closed, but never really resolved anything for the families still waiting on their small piece of $50 billion, split 1,000 different ways across a country that's still burying people. Individual members of the family, for whatever it's worth to the people still grieving, have largely gone on with their lives out of public view. Some still hold the wealth accumulated across 3 generations, wealth that predates OxyContin by decades and will, in all likelihood, outlast the settlement by decades more. A handful have quietly funded new philanthropic efforts under different names, in different countries, far from the scrutiny and the protests that finally caught up with the Sackler name itself. Whether that counts as moving forward, disappearing, or simply waiting patiently for the story to fade from public memory depends entirely on who you happen to ask. The family's own attorneys, who would call it closure, or the parents somewhere in Ohio or West Virginia, still keeping an empty bedroom exactly the way their child left it, who would call it something else entirely. Whatever the Sackler name once meant on the side of a museum wing, that's not what it means anymore. And no settlement check changes what those 3 letters, OC, still mean to the people who lost someone to them. It's worth asking yourself, honestly, whether anything that's happened since has actually made any of that right.